Welcome to Partnered Up Business Law, Deals, and Dynamics.
Welcome back to Partnered Up Business Law, Deals, and Dynamics with Jeffrey and Fink, partner at Coren and Lichtenstein LLP in Massachusetts. Jeff advises business owners and partners on formation, growth, and dispute resolution for closely held companies. I'm Mack, and today we're talking about why we'll figure it out later often turns into one of the most expensive decisions a business could make. Jeff, welcome back.
Hey, Evan, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Jeff. Why does that whole saying we'll figure it out later second, sound reasonable to partners early on, even when the stakes are high?
Well, it sounds reasonable because in the moment it sounds smart, saves you money because you're not paying lawyers to argue about a problem you don't have yet. It saves time, and you get to keep moving with the fun stuff. There's even some emotional logic to it. So is that a word? Emotional logic. So saying we'll work it out later can feel like a sign of trust. Like we're close enough. We don't need to spell this out. And putting it in writing can make it feel like you're accusing your partner of something. And plus, most people genuinely don't like conflict. So kicking a hard issue down the road is a relief. And sometimes that road never forces the issue, so you might get away with it. Sometimes there's a cultural piece too. In some parts of the world, a signed contract is viewed kind of as a binding promise. And in others, the contract is just the starting point for an ongoing negotiation. So if that's the tradition you come from, figuring out later isn't avoidance. It's just how deals are supposed to work. So we'll figure it out later. May feel like trust. The downside is that sometimes it's just a bill you haven't opened yet.
What kind of issues do partners often put off dealing with early on?
Really depends on the partners and the particular business, but there are patterns that we see. So a lot of it is just plain economics. If you don't even know whether this thing's going to work, it's hard to justify spending real money to plan for problems you might never have. So it's reasonable. And the part that's almost invisible is that a lot of times people don't realize they're putting anything off. They haven't talked to a lawyer. So they don't really know the questions to ask. They're kind of working off templates or working with lawyers who are working off a template and really not asking these hard questions. So they're not really choosing to skip the hard questions. They just don't know the questions exist yet. So, they're effectively deciding to defer an issue they never heard of. But that's because they didn't want to devote the resources up front to finding out what those issues are.
So what tends to change inside a business that makes those, deferred issues suddenly impossible to ignore?
So usually it's some kind of shock to the system, coming in a few flavors. One is there's not enough money. The business is struggling and the pressure exposes every crack. Or sometimes it's too much money. Suddenly there's a lot of real value to fight over and people care a lot more about details that they happily waved off before. Sometimes a partner wants out. Maybe they're burned out. Maybe they just want to retire. Maybe they just want to move on. Partner gets seriously ill and has to step back. Now you're maybe running a 3-owner company with only 2 people. Or something that does happen, unfortunately, is several partners decide that one partner needs to go, whether it's performance, personality, fit, inability to make capital calls, if that's what your agreement says. Now you've got a situation where people want to force an exit and there's no playbook for it. Those can be expensive. And underneath all this, rules evolve. The person who is perfect for the job at the start isn't necessarily the right person a few years in.
Can you walk us through one of those situations where putting decisions off early ended up creating a much bigger problem down the road, Joe?
Sure. This one involved a small law firm. So partners had a handshake agreement. Here's the economic split. Here's how we vote. They never wrote anything down. This happens a lot with law firms, less with accounting firms, but it still happens a lot with them too. So the kind of people who are supposed to be making sure that their clients have good agreements don't do it for themselves. So in this case, by the time one partner said, maybe we should put our understanding down in writing, the firm was already under some pressure. People weren't comfortable with how the money was being split. Some people wanted more control. Some people were starting to complain about the quality of the other partners, which from the outside, I couldn't tell whether it was true or not, or whether it was just belly aching because they didn't like them anymore. And clients felt all this, it reverberates outside the company. And they started heading for the exits, which then piled on the financial pressure. And then the act of finally sitting down to write the agreement, getting people to confront the things they'd avoided, just brought out the worst in everybody. And I've used this word before. There wasn't enough glue to hold them together. And so the firm broke up. So the hard conversations that would have saved the firm on day one were the straw that broke the camel's back at the end. They just had the conversation too late.
How does time itself change leverage once disagreements finally surface?
So it changes a lot and changes differently depending on the business. So in a service business, leverage also often follows the money and the history. So who controls the clients, who's been carrying internal and external relationships. I don't want to minimize the internal stuff because those dynamics are a lot of the things that contribute to both success and failure. So in manufacturing or distribution business, the roles and responsibilities shift over time. And it could be that whoever ends up holding the operations together holds the leverage, or if there's some inventor or something behind things, he or she may have some leverage. So in tech or life sciences, people are expecting outside investors to come in, and if that doesn't happen, that's a problem. And if it does happen, everyone's expectations change. The owners, management, the employees, and not everyone adapts to it. Some people are fantastic in a small organization and struggle as it gets bigger. Others do terribly in a startup and can only survive in that big environment. So personality alignment turns out to matter as much as the cap table does. I'm a big believer in the management theory that you need diversity of type within a business. So you need people who see things differently. And the problem comes that sometimes those different views of things turn into different visions for the business. And it's a problem. Kind of the bottom line, there's a great insight from the organizational development people. Every company really has two org charts. Every organization has two org charts. There's the formal one on paper, and there's an informal one based on how respect and influence evolve. So other people actually listen to. And as time goes on, that informal chart becomes the one that matters more. And it'll quietly rewrite who has the leverage. And that'll affect both what kind of disagreements come up and how they're resolved.
Where do you usually see costs show up first when things haven't been thought through, financially, operationally, and personally?
Honestly, all three, and they feed on each other. So financially, it shows up when expectations about money shift. Could be because the business is making more money than expected or less. And it shows up when a partner hits money trouble at home because suddenly what they need from the business changes. So operationally, it shows up when a company doesn't have what it needs to thrive. So whether that's the right leadership, the right technology, the right people, and as anybody who's in business knows, if operational problems snowball, so one gap creates the next one. And personally, it's when somebody wants more money or more control or simply feels disrespected by their partners. So as tempers start to fray, disrespect is cheap to hang out, but it's really expensive to repair.
So, Jeff, how does addressing uncertainty early on affect the tone and the options available if partners, eventually start to disagree?
It's simple, really. If there's a roadmap, most people will follow it most of the time. So having an agreed path takes some of the heat out of the moment. But if somebody's truly determined not to follow it because they think it's not in their best interest, sometimes nothing short of a lawsuit is going to stop them. A document can't force good faith, but it dramatically raises the odds that good faith holds. The flip side of that is, there's this legal concept that every contract has an implied obligation of good faith and fair dealing. And my litigator colleagues tell me that if you have to start your complaint talking about how the other partner has a lack of good faith and has not been engaged in fair dealing, that by itself is probably a loser. So it's hard to distinguish good faith from or bad faith from just different views of the business. But when that bad faith stuff crosses over into other things like taking more money for yourself because you feel you deserve it, that's a problem. So here's what I think is probably the most important idea to talk about today. Going through this process early, struggling with the hard questions together can actually draw partners closer if it's done right. So the effort itself creates some glue that holds people together later when the problems show up. Uh, it's like talking about potential problems early on in your personal relationships. It can bind you together a little bit more. Because the document's just a framework. So the people are actually the partnership. So the question I'm always asking as an advisor and as a partner myself is what gets people aligned and what gets them aligned early on.
And to kind of close things out here, Jeff, for business owners who want to be realistic without over, layering things or lawyering things, what kinds of issues are worth, settling sooner rather than later?
Well, first thing I have to say is that as a lawyer, my view of what's over lawyering may be different than than civilians.
Yeah.
But the important thing is you need to get four things settled: money, control, exits, which could just be a right of first refusal, and could be more formal provisions about retirement and people voluntarily leaving, and do they get bought out, and what's the price, and can you force them out, and what happens if someone becomes disabled, what happens to their interest if they die, all those kinds of things. And last is how to handle a fight, because there are going to be disagreements. Uh, so if you get those right, you've handled most of what breaks partnerships apart. And I wish you luck.
Good stuff. Jeff, pleasure as always.
Thank you. Great to see you again.
That's it for today's episode of Partnered Up Business Law, Deals, and Dynamics. To learn more about Jeff Fink and his work with the business owners and partners at Coren and Lichtenstein LLP, visit cl-lawgroup.com. Thanks for listening, and be sure to like, subscribe to the show, and leave a review if you found this episode helpful, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.